Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
How are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I appreciate it.
No, definitely. It's my pleasure.
Excellent. I'd like to start by asking how you describe yourself and what you do.
I am a writer in the short of it. You know, some people say an author. But at the same time, I write more than just books. I write blog posts. I write short stories. I used to write a lot of poetry. So a writer is the simplest and most accurate way to describe me now. But that's not where I started. I started as in the marketing industry, actually, in advertising, but not making the ad units. I was actually on the back side, the creepy side, where we figure out the target demographics and who we want to buy the products and how to reach them. So I did a lot of people studying in order to be able to do that. And then from there, I ended up being the console specialist for Activision and a couple of other big game studios before my husband ended up getting a job opportunity in another state. And I had already been writing on the side in between work or when I was home. And I took that as my sign to, if I want to make this into the career and into something more than just a hobby passion project, this is my sign to do it. So when we moved, I didn't try to continue my professional career when we started his new adventure in a different field, and have been writing my young adult fantasy novels ever since, full time.
Wow, that's wonderful.
And it's not common anymore because, you know, people don't buy. There's so many books out there, and the Kindle versions and the ebooks are just so much more inexpensive than the paperbacks. And if you're not one of the big 5 publishers, you're a small business, right? So you're not making what everyone thinks of when they think of an author, like, oh, J.K. Rowling, she's a billionaire. Everyone must be making that much money if you have a published book. And that's unfortunately not true for most writers and authors.
Right. So before we get too much into your writing career, I would like to back up just a little bit and talk about your career in communications and marketing. Particularly, what interested you about studying communications and marketing at USC?
So people are always interesting. We're fascinating creatures. We all do the same thing, but our motivations for getting to that path are always so different that, you know, taking my love of just interpersonal relationships and people watching, it always sounds a little bit creepy to say that I like studying people. But that's what it really comes down to when you think of how much of communication isn't actually verbal. It's, you know, nonverbal and watching the cues that everyone, you know, gives when you respond to a question. I always found that interesting, especially as growing up. I have a brother who has Asperger's, which means that he has a very hard time processing those nonverbal cues and understanding, especially as a child. He, you know, as they get older, it gets easier. But as a child, he couldn't understand sarcasm or, you know, when people were joking around or make believe. And so that kind of started me young on trying to figure out, well, why is it so different for him versus me? And so when I got into USC, communication just felt like the natural fit because of my early interest because of my family situation. And from there, it just felt like one way to really turn that into a career because I didn't want to do PR. I don't like that kind of spin or doing that kind of, I don't want to call it journalism, but, just that field in general, marketing without making the creative, because my art skills are severely lacking. It felt like the natural fit to marry those two and do, the traditional thing to get that 9-to-5 job where I can afford to do and, buy a house or not live in my parents' home for forever. So that's kind of, I tried to pick something that was going to make the money I was supposed to earn with a college degree.
Sure. And that sounds like a very good idea on paper.
On paper, it is always a great idea to make money.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you spent a number of years, I guess, studying people's behaviors from behind the scenes. In doing that, what were some of your favorite books that helped you dive deeper into that? And what were some of the more fascinating things you learned about people in general?
Well, I have a couple of craft books that I use now that are actually some of the most helpful things that I use for figuring out people. They're like the emotion thesaurus and the negative trait and positive trait thesaurus. Because you think about it, when you're trying to describe someone as being scared, you could look at someone and see that their eyes are darting back and forth, or there's a sheen of sweat on their brow, or maybe they're chewing on their bottom lip. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times when writers or artists first start they're early on in their career, they will say, oh, he was scared. And that doesn't really convey what they're feeling or how they're feeling that feeling, to be really redundant. So some of those books have been really fabulous and just kind of going deeper. And so some of the books that I read that do that really well, actually, right now it's a graphic novel. Have you heard of SAGA?
No, I haven't.
It's fabulous. It's kind of this mixture of fantasy and science fiction. So very science fantasy, where you have, people with horns that cast magic and people with wings and the conflict that they have. And it's very complex with the motivations that people want, and that you get into this world where you can see behind the veil of the war. It's not so black and white of, oh, we hate them and they invaded our planet, but why are we still fighting? This was centuries almost in the making. And so these two people come together, fall in love, they're trying to have a family, and the powers that be don't want people to know that they can get along, because then the war would end. And as a lot of people in the world today has shown us, that war is a lucrative business. So it's very much kind of in that, and it gets really dark and really adult. But I kind of like that it, in the format of a graphic novel, it doesn't shy away from those very real and gritty and uncomfortable discussions, that are very human, even in a fantasy setting.
Yeah. I'm sorry, can you say the title again, and please spell it?
SAGA, SAGA.
Okay, it is SAGA. Okay, just make sure I heard that correctly. Excellent.
Yeah. There's a bunch of them out. I think there's at least 8.
Oh, cool. Which one is your favorite? If I were going to start at one, should I just start at book 1?
Yeah, you kind of have to, unfortunately. Otherwise, you're not going to know who the characters are. I've only read up through 4 because I'm trying to pace myself. I run out of bookshelf space really quickly.
Okay, sure. Okay, so you've been working then in the advertising space for a number of years, and then decided to go into writing full-time when you and your husband moved. Had you been writing on the side up until that point, or what was the moment you decided you wanted to become a writer?
So it's a funny story. It was one of those things where it always was just something I did, and it wasn't something I consciously thought about as a career or something that you could just do. Because as a kid, I thought, oh, books just appear. And I just read them and I like them. But in the 4th grade, I actually wrote my first, I hesitate to call it a novel because I never finished it. But I wrote this first really long story about 5 sisters who were all princesses, and the youngest one had a dragon named Walter. I don't know what happened to it, but I distinctly remember that being the first time I actively tried to write a novel, or at least something that was longer than what most young kids are writing at that time. But I never really thought about it as something that I want to grow up and be this. But there was always these little signs as I was going through my life where, oh, in 6th grade, I won a writing contest, or in my career, my boss would always tell me, you write books, not emails. Just these little things until finally I was in a place where I was just kind of bored, and I had a lot of free time to think while I was at my job. And so I was taking notes and thinking of, well, I really like how this piece of fantasy works, but what if I did this instead? And so I started making these notes while at work. And from there, it just sort of dovetailed into writing. So it was a long time coming that I didn't know about until the universe hit me in the head with it.
Oh, sure. So why did you choose this particular genre?
People always think that fantasy is this way to kind of escape and not deal with the world. But I think in a lot of ways, if you do it right, it can be a way to kind of deal with the world instead of just avoiding it. Because you can use fantasy as a way to deal with prejudice or racism. I mean, and it's kind of topical for today, Stan Lee passed away, but if you look at the X-Men and what they were able to do with those stories, mutants were treated a lot like how the oppressed cultures in America were treated, and are still being treated a lot of times. But in the guise of fantasy, people can digest it without necessarily, feeling preached to. Which always, unless that's something you want, like you go in wanting to read a nonfiction, then a lot of people kind of shy away from that, and then they can kind of live in their own little bubble where everything's just, happy, meet cute romance. But I really liked that sort of fantasy that was just dealt with very real life problems, but in a way that one made the heroes feel like these total badasses, and you go in there and being like, yeah, she's got anxiety, but damn it if she's not going to kill everything that's standing in her way and overcome that monster. So you can, even if your monsters are just depression or anxiety, when a character who is doing amazing things also has those, I feel like it helps a lot of readers feel like, hey, I can be okay too. So that's why I like realistic fantasy, even if it has a ton of magic in it. I don't like characters that are just so perfect that there's almost no struggle. It's just, the mustache twirling villain and the godly hero are always clashing because he's good and he's bad, and that's just how it goes.
Right.
I love the gray area, and fantasy does that a lot with a lot more creativity and freedom than something like a contemporary fiction where you're kind of constricted to what is real and what is actually in front of you.
Yeah. So could you discuss maybe your writing process a little bit, what your influences come from, how you structure your writing? Because I know that you have a series. I don't want to butcher the title. It's The Monsters of, is it Selkirk?
Yes, The Monster of Selkirk.
Okay.
So there's these two kind of different camps that a lot of people think of when they start writing. It's like, are you a plotter or a pantser? And plotters are those guys who sit down and they have everything mapped out ahead of time. Not only have they built the world and the characters, they have step by step gone through every chapter and every scene in terms of what needs to happen and where the characters need to go. And they have all of that outline in front of them. And then there's the pantsers who just kind of, as the name suggests, fly by the seat of their pants and like, you know what, I'm just going to do and go with wherever the characters tell me. And so you get a lot more prose and sort of meandering with those kind of plot lines. I'm kind of a